The deed to the Carver ranch still read Eleanor Carver in the county register, and every man in Dusty Creek, Texas knew that Eleanor Carver had been cold in the ground for 4 years, but nobody had dared say a word to Clyde about it, because the look in his eyes when her name came up could silence a thunderstorm. It was the spring of 1882, and the land around Dusty Creek had woken up slow and reluctant, the way it always did after a hard winter. The mesquite trees were budding their pale green. The creek itself was running full and loud with snowmelt from the distant hills, and the cattle on the Carver land were fat and restless, crowding the fence lines and lowing at each other in the long amber afternoons. Clyde Carver had kept every acre of it alive through sheer stubborn will. 240 acres of Texas grassland, a main house that needed a new roof on the east side, a barn that had seen better decades, and a bunkhouse where 3 hired hands slept and argued about poker and women with equal passion. Clyde himself was 34 years old, broad through the shoulders, lean through the middle, with hands that were rough and scarred from wire and rope, and the particular violence that ranching demanded of a man every single day. His hair was dark brown going to a premature gray at the temples, which gave him a look of authority he had never asked for and didn't especially want. His eyes were the particular shade of gray-green that the creek ran in late summer, clear and still on the surface and deeper than it looked. He had a jaw that looked like it had been carved rather than grown, and a mouth that had forgotten how to smile easy, though it remembered how once. He wore the same style of clothes every day without thinking about it: canvas trousers, a worn flannel shirt, suspenders, boots that needed resoling and had needed it for 2 years, and a hat with a sweat-stained brim that had been through more weather than most men twice his age. He had married Eleanor Vasquez when he was 27, and she was 25, and they had built the ranch together from a half-broken claim left by a man who had gone west to California and never returned to argue about it. Eleanor had been a serious woman with a bright laugh and strong opinions about which cattle to sell and which to keep, and she had been right about nearly everything. And Clyde had loved her with the particular depth of a quiet man who does not say what he feels but shows it in 10,000 small daily ways. When she died of a fever in the January of 1878, leaving him alone with the ranch, and a grief so solid it had weight and texture, Clyde had done the only thing he knew how to do. He had gotten up before sunrise and gone to work. He had never changed the deed. It was a small, irrational thing, and he knew it, and he knew that Sheriff Dahlin knew it, and that the land office in Abilene had sent 2 polite letters about the matter which Clyde had filed in the stove. The ranch was Eleanor's in some way that the law could not entirely measure, and he had no desire to make it otherwise. The hired men, Tom Eccles, who was 40 and had worked cattle for 20 years, Pete Garza, who was 22 and the best horseman Clyde had ever seen, and a quiet Comanche man named Joseph, who nobody knew the full story of and who was wise enough not to explain it. They understood the arrangement without needing it spelled out for them. A man grieved the way he grieved. The ranch ran. That was what mattered. What Clyde had not expected on a Tuesday morning in late April of 1882 was the wagon. He heard it before he saw it, which was how things arrived in that country. The sound of iron-rimmed wheels on dry Caliche Road carried half a mile in the clear morning air, and Clyde had come around the side of the barn with a fence-post digger over one shoulder when the wagon came through the gate that marked the beginning of the long lane to the main house. It was a rented wagon from the look of it, a livery rig from town, the kind the stage office kept for passengers who arrived with more luggage than a saddle horse could carry. And sitting on the bench beside old Harlan Riggs, who drove for the stage and the livery both, was a woman Clyde had never seen in his life. He stood still and watched the wagon come up the lane. She was not what he had expected to see, though he could not have said what he had expected. She was perhaps 28, 29 years old, sitting straight-backed on the wagon bench with her hands folded in her lap, and her face turned toward the ranch buildings with an expression of careful, deliberate composure that told Clyde immediately she was working at that composure, that it was not natural ease but practiced control. She wore a dark blue traveling dress that had seen considerable travel and a straw hat with a practical brim, and her dark hair was pinned up under it with several escaping strands that the wind had gotten hold of. She had a trunk in the wagon bed and a smaller bag beside her on the seat, and the look of someone who had come a very long way and intended to mean it. Clyde set the fence post digger against the barn wall and walked toward the wagon. Harlan pulled the rig up and set the brake with the particular satisfaction of a man who has delivered something complicated and is glad to be rid of it. "Morning, Clyde," he said. "Got a passenger for you." "I can see that," Clyde said. The woman looked down at him from the wagon bench. Her eyes were dark brown, nearly black in the morning shadow of her hat brim, and they were measuring him with an honesty that was neither rude nor apologetic. "Are you Clyde Carver?" she asked. Her voice was clear and direct, with an accent that placed her somewhere east of here, maybe Missouri, maybe further north. Not a Texas voice at all. "I am," Clyde said. "My name is Sadie Baker," she said. "I'm the woman your cousin Harlan wrote to about the housekeeper position." There was a pause that lasted approximately 3 full seconds, during which Clyde's mind did several things in rapid succession. It confirmed that his cousin Harlan, who was not old Harlan Riggs, but rather his cousin Harlan Carver in San Antonio, had apparently been writing letters on his behalf. It noted that he had not known about any housekeeper position because he had not advertised one, and it registered with a particular clarity that Sadie Baker was looking at him with the kind of steady directness that suggested she had not come all this way to be told there had been a misunderstanding. "Step down," he said finally. "We'll talk inside." Old Harlan helped her down from the wagon with more gallantry than Clyde had managed, and then began unloading her trunk with a speed that suggested he intended to be gone before the conversation got complicated. Clyde did not stop him. The inside of the main house was clean in the way that a man's house is clean when he has given up on anything more than functional order. The floors were swept, the dishes were washed and stacked, the table had no cloth on it because the cloth had worn through 3 years ago and he had not thought to replace it. Eleanor's curtains were still on the windows, faded from 4 years of Texas sun to a pale ghost of their original yellow. A photograph of Eleanor stood on the mantel above the small fireplace, framed in dark wood, and it was the first thing Sadie Baker looked at when she came through the door. She looked at it for a moment, then looked at Clyde. She did not say anything about it, which he noted. He set his hat on the hook by the door, an automatic gesture, and turned to face her in the middle of his kitchen. "I didn't write to anyone about a housekeeper," he said. "Not accusatory, just factual." Sadie Baker set her bag on the table, which was either forward or practical depending on how you looked at it, and folded her hands again. "Your cousin Harlan wrote on your behalf," she said. "He said you had a working ranch of considerable size, that you needed someone to manage the house and help with the books, and that the pay was $12 a month with room and board." She paused. "I understood it to be an honest offer." "Harlan," Clyde said, mostly to himself, with a feeling that was not quite irritation and not quite gratitude. "If there has been a misunderstanding," Sadie said, and her voice stayed even, but something in her eyes shifted, something careful and braced, "I would appreciate knowing it directly. I have come from St. Louis by train and the last leg by stage and then by Mr. Riggs's wagon, and I would prefer to deal with the truth plainly rather than dance around it." Clyde looked at her for a long moment. Then he pulled out one of the kitchen chairs and sat down in it because he thought better sitting. "What did Harlan tell you about this place?" he said. She sat as well across from him, back straight, hands flat on the table. "He told me the ranch ran 200 acres, give or take, that you had 3 hands, that the house needed a woman's management. He mentioned," she paused carefully, "that you had been widowed." 4 years ago, Clyde said. "Yes," she said, "I am sorry for it." "Are you a widow yourself?" he asked. It was a direct question, but not an impolite one. In 1882, in Texas, a woman traveling alone for a housekeeping position was generally either a widow or a woman with a particular kind of hard history, and he was not going to pretend otherwise. "I am," she said. "My husband James Baker died of consumption 2 years ago. I worked as a bookkeeper for a dry goods firm in St. Louis until the firm closed in the fall. Your cousin's letter arrived in February." She said it all without flinching, which told Clyde the grief was real, but she had made her peace with surviving it. He stood up, walked to the window, looked out at the lane where old Harlan's wagon was already rolling back toward the road at a pace that confirmed his earlier suspicion. He looked at the barn, the bunkhouse, the cattle in the near pasture. He looked at the photograph of a leaner on the mantel from across the room. $12 a month, he said, turning back to Sadie Baker. "Room in the house. There's a room at the east end it was intended for." He stopped, then started again. "It's empty and it has a good window. You'd manage the kitchen, the house accounts, correspondence. I'd need you to help me with the cattle books as well, tallying the sales records, writing letters to the buyers. Tom Eccles can barely write his own name, and Pete Garza writes in Spanish when he's in a hurry, which is always." Sadie Baker looked at him with those dark, direct eyes. "That sounds like the position I was told about," she said. "There's one thing you should know," Clyde said. He said it bluntly, not because he wanted to, but because it was a truth that would come out anyway, and he had always believed in getting ahead of the weather. "The deed to this ranch still reads Clyde Carver. I have not changed it. I do not intend to change it in the near term. Some people in town find that peculiar. I mention it because you will hear about it, and I'd rather you heard it from me." Sadie Baker looked at the photograph on the mantel for a second time. Then she looked back at Clyde. "That is your business and not mine," she said quietly. "I am here to work." And that, for the moment, was that. She was harder to ignore than he had expected. He had thought in the 2 days after her arrival, while he got used to the shape of another person in the house, that it would be like having a hired hand, functional and unremarkable. But Sadie Baker was neither of those things. She was in the kitchen before he was every morning, which startled him twice, and then became something he noticed the absence of on the one morning she was ill with a headache and stayed in her room until 8. She made coffee the right way, strong and black, which was something the hired men had never managed to do consistently. She attacked the house with a systematic thoroughness that was almost alarming. Within the first week she had scrubbed the floor, rehung Clyde's curtains after taking them down and washing them so they were pale yellow again instead of gray, repaired a chair leg that had been wired shut for 2 years, and somehow located a tablecloth in the trunk beneath the spare room bed that Clyde must have packed away and never used. The tablecloth was white with a small blue border. When Clyde came in for supper that first evening and saw it on the table, something went through him that he could not name precisely. He sat down and ate without comment, but his eyes went to it twice, and Sadie, who was already learning to watch him the way you learn to read weather on a plane's horizon, saw him look and said nothing. Tom Eccles declared at the end of the first week that Miss Sadie was the finest cook he had encountered since his mother, which was not saying everything, since Tom's mother had reportedly been a woman of limited culinary imagination, but he said it with such feeling that it counted. Pete Garza was more reserved around her, not from unfriendliness but from a shyness around women that he had never successfully cured. Joseph watched her from a respectful distance and eventually, on the 6th day, brought her a bunch of prairie wildflowers tied with a strip of rawhide, which he placed on the kitchen windowsill without explanation, and which Sadie received with a gravity and gratitude that suggested she understood the gesture was not a small one. "You are good with people," Clyde told her one evening at the end of the 2nd week. They were sitting at the table after supper with the account books open between them, and Sadie had been going through the cattle sales records for the past 2 years with the focused precision of a woman who had genuinely worked with numbers. She looked up. "I have had practice," she said simply, "Joseph doesn't bring flowers to just anyone," Clyde said. "I know," she said. "I was honored." He watched her go back to the ledger. "You've found the error already," he said. It was not a question. He had seen her expression 3 minutes ago when she turned the page. "You sold 43 head to the Abilene buyer in October of last year," she said, "but the record only shows payment for 41. Either two animals were not accounted for or the buyer underpaid by $11.40. "Underpaid," Clyde said. "I knew it at the time. I wrote a letter." "Did you receive a response?" "No." She picked up the pen from its rest. "I'll write a second letter," she said, "with the specific records cited. In my experience, errors like that tend to get corrected more quickly when the person receiving the letter understands that the person writing it knows exactly what they are looking at." Clyde watched her begin to write. Her handwriting was small, precise, and completely legible, which was in itself a remarkable thing in a world where most of his business correspondence arrived in a scrawl that required interpretation. Something loosened in his chest, a small tightening he had been carrying for so long he had stopped noticing it until its absence made itself felt. "You were a good bookkeeper," he said. "I was an excellent bookkeeper," she said without looking up, and there was just enough humor in her voice to make it something other than bragging. He laughed. It surprised him. It had been a while since a laugh had come out of him without effort, and this one arrived completely naturally, and he sat with it for a moment after it had subsided, feeling its echo. Sadie looked up from the ledger and her eyes were bright, and she was very nearly smiling, but she was containing it, the way you contain something good when you are not sure it is welcome. "I'll get you the letter Weaver sent," Clyde said, standing and going to the small wooden cabinet where he kept correspondence. He was doing it partly because the letter was useful and partly because he needed to do something with his hands, and he did not examine the second reason any further than that. The weeks accumulated. May came in hot and windy, the way Texas May did, with the grass going from green to gold on the south-facing slopes and the cattle beginning to range further for water in the afternoons. Clyde and the men were out long days, checking fence lines, moving the herd, dealing with a broken windmill pump at the north tank that took 2 days and considerable profanity from Tom Eccles to repair. Sadie kept the house and the books and managed the larder with a competence that freed up the corners of Clyde's mind. He had always kept occupied with domestic anxiety, so he found himself thinking more clearly about the ranch itself, seeing things he had not had the attention for. She rode out to the north pasture on a Wednesday with a message from the land office in Abilene, a third letter about the deed, and Clyde saw her come across the grass on the spare horse, a dun mare named Copper that nobody had ridden much since a leaner stopped. She rode competently, not like a cowhand, but like a woman who had grown up with horses and maintained the skill the way you maintain any useful thing. She did not look awkward on the horse. She looked natural, which for some reason irritated him slightly and pleased him a great deal. He took the letter from her on horseback, read it, folded it, and put it in his shirt pocket. "Same as the others," he said. "Are you going to answer it?" she asked. "Eventually." She looked out over the pasture. The wind was moving through the grass in long silver waves, and the cattle were dark shapes in the distance, and the sky above was the particular deep blue that only happened in Texas in the late afternoon. "It's beautiful land," she said. "Yes," Clyde agreed. "Aliner must have loved it," she said, and it was the first time she had said Aliner's name, and she said it with a careful gentleness that made it feel like a door being opened rather than a wound being touched. Clyde was quiet for a moment. "She did," he said. "She always said it was better than she had any right to expect." He paused. "She grew up in San Antonio. She wasn't a country girl originally. She chose it." "The things we choose mean more sometimes," Sadie said, "than the things we're born to." He looked at her. She was still looking at the pasture, her hat brim turned to the west and the afternoon light on her profile, and she was not saying it to him specifically. He thought she was saying it the way people say true things when they are thinking out loud in a place that feels big enough to hold them. He thought about asking her what she had chosen and what she had been born to, but the moment was one of those moments that didn't want too many words put in it. "I should get back," he said. "Tom's waiting on me at the east fence." "I'll head back to the house," she said, and turned the mare, and he watched her go for longer than the situation required before he turned his own horse east. That night he sat on the porch after supper, which was a thing he had stopped doing a few years back because the evenings alone had gotten too loud with their own silence. He sat in the wooden chair that had always been his and looked at the creek glinting in the last light and listened to the coyotes start up in the North Hills. The door opened behind him and Sadie came out with 2 cups of coffee and set one on the porch railing near his hand without asking, and then sat in the other chair, Alina's chair, which he noticed and said nothing about, and held her own cup and watched the dark come in from the east. "You don't have to sit out here," Clyde said. Not unwelcomingly, just as a statement. "I know," Sadie said. "I like evenings." She sipped her coffee. The evenings in St. Louis were never quiet like this. There was always street noise, cart noise, neighbors. This is different. "Do you miss it?" "Parts of it," she said honestly. "I miss the library. I miss being able to walk somewhere in 10 minutes, she considered. "I don't miss most of it." "This is a hard life," Clyde said. "Not just the work, the isolation." "I'm not afraid of hard," she said, and it was not bravado, just truth. He heard the difference. "No," he said, "I don't believe you are." The coyotes called again, closer now, a rising and falling song that echoed off the bluffs west of the creek. Sadie turned her head toward the sound with something like pleasure. He watched her listen to it, and thought that Alina had loved that sound too, had called it the music of the country, and he waited for the familiar grief to arrive the way it always did when he thought of Alina in the context of something new. It came, but it was smaller than it used to be, and alongside it was something else, something warm and uncertain that he did not know quite what to call. He called it tiredness and went inside, and if he lay awake for an extra hour listening to the quiet of the house, he did not admit it to himself. June came in with the first real heat. Clyde drove cattle north with Tom and Pete for a full week, leaving Joseph to watch the home place and Sadie to manage without them. He expected to come home to chaos of some small variety, a fence problem unreported, the larder disorganized, some small domestic matter left undone. He came home instead to find that Joseph had repaired the barn roof that had been leaking for 2 seasons, that the kitchen garden Sadie had planted in May was coming in strong with tomatoes and beans and squash, and that she had driven herself to Dusty Creek in the buckboard and negotiated a new contract with the hardware merchant for wire and nails at a price 3 cents per item lower than the price Clyde had been paying. He stood in the kitchen and read the contract while she ladled stew into bowls and told him about it with the brisk efficiency of a woman reporting a business matter. When she finished, he set the contract down and looked at her. 3 cents lower, he said. "Mr. Pruitt was charging more than the market warranted," she said. "I told him so with the current price listings from the Abilene wholesale as reference. He was reasonable about it once he understood I had the figures." "Where did you get the Abilene listings?" "I wrote to the office in Abilene 3 weeks ago asking for their current schedule. It arrived last Thursday." She set the bread on the table. "I hope you don't mind that I went to town. I took the buckboard." "I don't mind," he said, and he meant it on every level, and he thought she could hear that, because she sat down and looked at him with that almost smile again, contained and warm. Tom Eccles came in for supper that evening with mud on his boots and a look of considerable contentment. "Good to be home," he said, which was a thing Tom said rarely, and Pete nodded along, and Joseph ate 3 bowls of the stew without comment, which was the highest possible endorsement from a man who ate with remarkable restraint. After supper, Clyde walked out to the small rise east of the house where he sometimes went when he needed to think clearly. The moon was rising fat and yellow over the hills, and the cattle were settled, and the creek was loud with early summer running. He thought about the deed still in Alina's name. He thought about the letters from Abilene. He thought about a woman who drove herself to town and negotiated hardware contracts from wholesale price schedules she had written away for on her own initiative. He thought about sitting on the porch in the evenings and the particular quiet that had come back into it. He went back to the house and knocked on the door of Sadie's room, which he had never done before, and when she said to come in, he opened the door and stood in the doorway. She was sitting at the small writing desk he had moved into the room for her bookwork, and she turned to look at him with no alarm, just attention. "I'm going to go to Abilene next week," he said. "I need to see about some stock. I thought if you wanted to come, you could look at the dry goods prices directly instead of by mail." She held his gaze for a moment. "I'd like that," she said. "It's a 2-day ride," he said. "We'd stay at the hotel in Abilene." "I know what 2 days means," she said, and there was no misunderstanding in her voice, just clarity, and he appreciated that about her enormously. "Right," he said. "I'll let you know the day." He closed the door and stood in the hall for a moment in the dark, listening to his own pulse, which was doing something unreasonable. They left on a Thursday, just the two of them, because Tom needed to stay with the cattle and Pete had a family matter in a neighboring town, and Joseph never went to Abilene on principle that Clyde respected and did not ask about. Sadie wore her best dress, which was dark green and practical, and a different hat than her traveling hat, and she had a satchel with the accounts and the letters and 2 other things Clyde had not asked about. He wore clean clothes and his second-best hat, and had shined his boots for the first time in a period he was embarrassed to calculate. They rode side by side on the first day, talking easily in the way that had been building between them for 2 months now, about the ranch, about cattle prices, about a news item she had read in the paper Tom had brought from town about the railroad expanding south, about what that might mean for shipping cattle to market. He told her about the first years of the ranch, when he and Alina had started with 12 cows and a prayer, and she listened without interrupting, and when he paused she asked questions that showed she had been paying attention to every word. She told him about St. Louis in a way she had not before, more detail than the short factual account she had given on her first day. About her father, who had been a printer and had taught her to read at 4 and arithmetic at 5, because he believed women should know how to manage their own affairs. About James Baker, who had been a kind man and a good husband, who had worked at the printing firm until consumption took him at 31, which had left her at 27 with no children and a small, insufficient savings, and a world that did not have much architecture for a widow of modest means with exceptional arithmetic skills. "Your cousin Harlan wrote a very good letter," she said. "I imagine he did," Clyde said. "Harlan has always been better at my life than I am. Have you seen him recently? Christmas before last. He came up from San Antonio with his wife." He paused. "I should write and thank him." "I already did," Sadie said. He looked at her. She was looking forward at the trail, a small smile at the corner of her mouth. "Did you?" he said. "I wrote him 3 weeks ago," she said. "I told him the position was everything he had described, and that the ranch was beautiful, and that you were a decent and honorable man." The trail went quiet for a moment. The horses moved steadily in the warm afternoon. Somewhere in the cedar breaks to the east, a mockingbird was practicing its entire repertoire. "Decent and honorable," Clyde said. "Those are high compliments," she said. "Do not be insulted by them." "I'm not insulted," he said quietly. He was not insulted. He was something else entirely, something warm and alarming that he carried quietly for the rest of the day's ride. They stopped at a way station at sundown and ate at the rough table with the station keeper's family, a taciturn man named Fowler and his wife, and 2 small daughters who stared at Sadie with the frank amazement of children who did not see new women often. Sadie talked to the children with an ease and warmth that gave him a clear view of something he had been noticing in pieces. She was good with people the way some people are good with horses, not by pretending to be something other than she was, but by being exactly herself in a way that made others feel they could do the same. The older girl showed her a corn doll she had made, and Sadie admired it so specifically, and genuinely that the girl blushed scarlet with pleasure. Clyde watched from across the table and felt something settle in him like a stone, finding the bottom of still water. Abilene was busy and loud and smelled of cattle and sawdust and ambition, which was what Abilene had smelled of since the cattle drives had made it what it was. Though by 1882, the drives were moving further west, and the town was reinventing itself with banks and churches and dry goods emporia. They stayed at the Drovers Hotel, which was respectable and had separate corridor rooms, and Clyde took care of the stock business in the morning, while Sadie went to the dry goods house and the wholesale office with her list and her price records and her particular manner of making men with ledgers feel that she already knew exactly what the numbers said. She found him at the stock pen at noon and handed him a written summary of what she had negotiated. Lower price on flour, sugar, and lamp oil. A new supplier for leather goods at a significantly better rate. An arrangement with the dry goods house to ship a quarterly order to Dusty Creek rather than requiring a seasonal trip, at a delivery fee that was less than the cost of 2 days' travel. He read it standing at the fence with his hat pushed back on his head and 250 pounds of steer regarding him from 3 feet away. "Sadie," he said, and his voice had something in it that surprised him. "It's just numbers," she said. "Numbers are honest if you read them correctly." "It's not just numbers," he said. He stopped. The steer lost interest and moved away. Clyde turned to face her. The midday light was full on her and the noise of Abilene was all around them, and she was looking at him with those dark eyes that were waiting for whatever he was going to say without any pressure in them at all. "Thank you," he finished. It was not everything he had started to say, but it was what came out. "You're welcome," she said simply. They ate dinner at the hotel dining room that evening, which was a different thing entirely from eating at the ranch table, and Clyde found himself sitting across from her with a candle between them and the low rumble of other people's conversations around them, and noticing things about her that the ranch setting did not display as clearly. The way she held herself in public, poised and quiet, the kind of composure that was real and not performed. The way she talked to the waiter, politely and directly. The way she ordered food without fussing about the menu, which he found absurdly satisfying for a reason he could not entirely explain. He told her about a cattle deal gone wrong 3 years back, a buyer in Kansas who had reneged on a contract and cost him nearly $300, and he told it well enough that she laughed at the right moment, not at his loss, but at the absurdity of the buyer's excuse, which had involved an act of God in the form of a hailstorm that had nothing to do with the price of beef. Her laugh was full and real, not a polite sound but an actual response, and it did something to the quality of the air around them that he noticed and did not comment on. "You should have sued him," she said. "I considered it. Cost more to get a lawyer than to absorb the loss." "That's usually how it works," she agreed. "The law tends to benefit people who can afford to use it." "That's a particular view for a woman in 1882, he said. She looked at him evenly. "I have had cause to arrive at it," she said. He thought of her alone in St. Louis with a dead husband and a closed business, and a set of arithmetic skills that should have been worth more than the world wanted to pay for them. He thought about the injustice of it, the specific injustice of it. A capable, intelligent woman with options so limited they barely qualified as options. He felt an anger on her behalf that was not romantic, precisely, but was adjacent to something that was. "You're worth more than $12 a month," he said abruptly. She blinked. It was the first time he had surprised her, he thought, genuinely caught her off guard, and there was something satisfying and gentle about seeing it. "You pay me fairly for the position described," she said carefully. "I pay you for a housekeeper position," he said. "You are operating as an accountant and a procurement officer and a kitchen manager and a correspondent and God knows what else. It isn't right." "Clyde, $18, he said. "From July." She opened her mouth, then closed it, then said, "That's generous." "It's accurate," he said. "There's a difference." She was quiet for a moment, and when she looked up again, there was something in her eyes that was different from her usual composure, something warmer and less guarded, and she looked at him as though she was seeing him very clearly. "Thank you," she said, and it sounded the way his thank you on the street had probably sounded, not a social courtesy but a real thing. They rode back to the ranch the next day, and the ride was different from the ride out. Not quieter, they talked as much, but different in the way that two people are different after they have eaten dinner together by candlelight and said a few true things. The distance between the horses felt more considered. When the trail narrowed and they rode single file through a cedar brake, he went first and held a low branch for her without thinking about it. And when they came out the other side, she thanked him with a look rather than words, and he understood the look completely. They got back to the ranch in the late afternoon. Tom and Pete and Joseph were at the far pasture, and the house was quiet and warm in the evening sun, and the kitchen garden was standing straight and green. Clyde took care of the horses while Sadie went inside, and when he came to the kitchen she had coffee on, and was unpacking the small parcels from the Abilene dry goods in the systematic way she had of doing everything. "Good trip," he said. "Yes," she agreed. He stood in the kitchen doorway longer than was necessary. She was not looking at him, but her hands had slowed on the parcels. The evening light came through Alina's clean yellow curtains and lay in long strips across the floor. "Sadie," he said. She turned around. Her hands were still and her eyes were very clear. "I want to say something," he said, "and I want to say it without being—" He stopped, choosing words with the care of a man who knows his vocabulary for this kind of thing is limited and takes the limitation seriously. "I want to say it plainly." "Say it plainly then," she said, and her voice was steady but not cold. "These past 2 months," he said, "having you here, it has been—" He stopped again, then made himself go on. "I had stopped expecting anything to be different. I had made a kind of accommodation with the way things were. And then you came, and things are different, and I find that I do not want to go back to the way they were." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, a sissortail flycatcher landed on the fence post and sang 2 notes and flew away. "I am not saying that to create an awkwardness," he continued. "I am saying it because you deserve to know it, and because I think you are a woman who prefers honesty to the alternative." Sadie Baker looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "I do prefer honesty." She turned the cup she had been unpacking around in her hands once, a small nervous motion he had not seen from her before. "I will be honest in return. I came here for a position. I did not come here expecting anything else, and I would not want you to think I have had any intention other than the one stated." "I don't think that," he said. "But," she said, and the word hung between them and she took a breath. "But I am not going to pretend that this place does not feel like somewhere I want to be. And I am not going to pretend that you are only an employer to me." She looked at him directly. "That would not be honest." Clyde Carver had spent 4 years learning how to hold things that hurt. He had not in those 4 years learned how to hold things that felt like this, and the feeling was so large and so unexpected that he stood very still under it, the way you stand still when the first warm rain comes after a long dry. "I'm not asking for anything you're not willing to give," he said. "I know," she said, "and I am not yet certain what I am willing to give, but I wanted you to have the truth." "That's enough," he said. "For now, that's more than enough." He went outside to check the stock, because he needed the night air and the familiar work of the animals. And when he came back inside, she had made supper and set the table with the blue-bordered tablecloth. And they ate by lamplight with the windows dark and the coyotes singing in the North Hills. And they did not talk about what had been said in the kitchen, but everything about the evening was colored by it. And he thought it was the most comfortable and the most charged meal he could remember eating since before Alina died. July passed like a dream that kept changing its shape. He did not rush her. That was the thing he was most careful about, because he had a sense that Sadie Baker was a woman who needed to arrive at her own conclusions in her own time, and that pressure, even gentle pressure, would do the opposite of what he wanted. So he gave her time the way you give a field time, with patience and with tending. But the tending came naturally now. He noticed when she looked tired and made sure the evening work was light. He brought her wildflowers on a Thursday with no explanation, the same kind Joseph had brought weeks earlier, and she put them in the same spot on the kitchen windowsill without comment, but with a warmth in her face that stayed with him all day. He read aloud to her sometimes in the evenings. They had found a shared taste for history, and he had 3 books on the shelf that had been Aline's, and the reading together in the lamplit kitchen had become a ritual that neither of them had planned. She, in turn, had started to give him things in the small, unannounced way of her. She repaired the pocket on his second-best shirt without mentioning it, so that he discovered it while dressing and stood holding the shirt for a moment with a feeling in his throat. She learned how he drank his coffee, not asking but observing, and it was always exactly right. One evening, she drew a map of the ranch's pasture sections from the descriptions he had given her and the records she had read, a precise and careful map with good proportions and clear labels, and gave it to him saying only that she thought it might be useful for the cattle records. It was the most useful single document related to the ranch he had owned in years. She was learning to love the land. He saw it happening, the way it happened with anyone who had good eyes and the capacity for wonder. She would stop on the way to the barn and look at the light on the distant bluffs, or stand at the creek bank in the evening watching the water run, or sit on the porch in the early morning with her coffee and her face turned east to the sunrise with an expression of such unguarded peace that he felt honored to see it. On a Saturday in late July, Tom Eccles and Pete Garza rode into Dusty Creek for the day, their monthly day off, and Joseph took himself somewhere on the back pasture with a fishing line and his own company. Clyde and Sadie were alone at the ranch for the full afternoon, which had not happened before, and neither of them had planned it, but both of them were aware of it. She was in the kitchen garden in the afternoon, staking up the tomato plants that had gotten heavy with fruit, and he came and helped without being asked, and they worked side by side in the sun for 2 hours, moving companionably through the rows, talking and not talking in easy alternation. Her sleeves were rolled up and there was dirt on her hands and her hat was pushed back on her head, and she looked completely at ease in a way that the first weeks had not shown him, the careful composure having given way over the months to something more genuine and unguarded. "I got a letter from my sister in Memphis," she said, tying a tomato cane to its stake with practiced fingers. "I didn't know you had a sister. Margaret. She's 2 years older. She has a husband and 3 children and a house full of opinions." She smiled. "She wanted to know how I was getting on." "What did you tell her?" Sadie was quiet for a moment, tying another cane. "I told her the truth," she said. "That I was well, that the work was good, that I had found somewhere that felt like it might be home." Clyde went still for a second, his hands on a tomato plant, looking at her profile in the afternoon sun. "She will want to know more than that," he said. "She always wants to know more than I am willing to tell her," Sadie said and laughed. He laughed too, and they went on working, and the afternoon sun went on making long gold light across the garden, and he thought that something was being built here, stone by patient stone, and that it was the most careful and most significant construction project he had been involved in. That evening, after supper, they sat on the porch. The moon was just past full, generous and pale in the south, and the land was silver and black and completely still. They had been sitting in a comfortable quiet for perhaps 20 minutes when Sadie said, without preamble, "I think I should tell you about James." Clyde turned to look at her. She was looking at the moon. "You told me he was a good man," Clyde said. "He was," she said. "He was kind and he was gentle and he worked hard and he never made me feel that my intelligence was an inconvenience to him, which was more than most men offered in 1875. She paused. "I loved him. I want you to know that, not as a warning but as a truth. I was not unhappy in my marriage." "I know," he said. "When he died," she stopped, then went on carefully. "I had thought that a part of me was over, that the kind of life I had imagined was finished and I was managing a reduced version of it. I had made peace with that. It seemed honest. He waited. "And then I came here," she said, and her voice was very quiet, and something that I thought was over turned out not to be. The moon moved behind a thin cloud and the silver light dimmed and then returned. Clyde set down his coffee cup. He turned in his chair to face her fully. "Sadie," he said. She turned to look at him. Her eyes were very clear in the moonlight, and she was not composing herself, not managing anything. She was just present, just real, just herself in the plainest possible way. "I know this is not simple," she said. "I know there is a leaner. I would not ask you to. A leaner would be glad of you," he said. The words came out with a certainty that surprised him with its clarity, the way the true things sometimes came out before the carefully managed things. She was not a woman who would have wanted me to be alone forever. She was practical in the way that people who really love someone are practical. She would have wanted me to be well. And she would have, he paused. She would have liked you enormously. Sadie's breath came out soft. "I'm not finished grieving her," he said. "I want to be honest about that." "I'm not asking you to be," she said. "But I am also," he said slowly, "not as far gone in it as I was. And I want to know if you would consider whether this could be." The plainspokenness deserted him momentarily, which was ironic given how specifically he had requested it for himself. He tried again. "I would like to court you, Sadie Baker, if that is something you would receive." She held his gaze for a long moment. The moon came back out from behind the cloud and filled the porch with light. "I would receive it," she said softly, "very willingly." He reached out and put his hand over hers where it rested on the arm of the chair, a gentle covering of her hand with his, and she turned her hand under his and held it, and they sat that way in the moonlight for a long time without saying anything else, because nothing else needed saying right then. August in Texas was a trial by heat. The creek shrank to a thin, bright thread in its banks. The grass went brown and crackled underfoot, and the cattle sought every scrap of shade and every puddle of remaining water with the serious single-mindedness of animals who understood the arithmetic of survival. Clyde and the men pushed the herd north to the upper pasture, where an underground spring kept a tank full, and fencing became the dominant labor of every day, stringing and restringing wire that the heat expanded, and the cattle leaned against with bored persistence. Sadie kept the house as cool as Texas summer permitted, which was not very, but she had a system of opening and closing shutters at particular times of day that made the interior noticeably better than the exterior, and she made cold supper in the evenings to spare the kitchen from additional heat, and she had identified the best place for a second water cistern behind the house and told Clyde about it with drawings and a cost estimate that he looked at and said he would build in the fall. She had stopped asking permission for things. He had noticed this and was glad of it. They were courting in the particular way of two adults in their late 20s and early 30s who already knew each other fairly well and who were not performing courtship for an audience but conducting it for themselves. He brought her things, not ostentatious gifts but useful ones. A good pen from Abilene that he had seen her admiring in a catalog, a book on cattle management that she had mentioned wanting, flowers when they were to be had, which in August was less frequent. She cooked things he had mentioned in passing that he liked. They spent their evenings together as a matter of course. He kissed her for the first time on a Wednesday evening in August, standing at the kitchen door as she came in from checking the garden in the last light, and it was brief and unhurried and completely right, and she stood for a moment afterward with her eyes still closed, and then opened them and looked at him and said nothing, which was entirely sufficient. Tom Eccles, who was observant in the way that men who work closely with other people become observant, said nothing for 2 weeks and then said, while they were fixing fence on the east line with Pete and Joseph present as well, "Going to be a wedding on this place before winter, I expect." He said it to no one in particular, looking at the wire he was stretching. Pete Garza said, "About time." Joseph said nothing but made a sound that from Joseph counted as enthusiastic agreement. Clyde kept his eyes on the fence post. "All of you can mind your own business," he said. Tom made a satisfied noise. "Ma'am," he said. On a Thursday in early September, two things happened within the same afternoon. The first was that Clyde went to Dusty Creek to the county office and signed the paperwork to update the deed on the Carver ranch. The woman at the desk, a middle-aged widow named Mrs. Pratt, who had known both Clyde and Eleanor, looked at the papers carefully and then looked at Clyde over her spectacles with an expression that was not unkind. "It's time," Clyde said simply. Mrs. Pratt nodded and stamped the papers. "Eleanor would understand," she said. "I know," he said. The deed now read Clyde Carver. The second thing that happened was that when he got home, he found Sadie on the porch with a letter in her hand, and an expression he had not seen before, not distressed, exactly, but stirred, as if something inside had been moved from one place to another. "What is it?" he asked, coming up the porch steps. "A letter from my sister Margaret," she said. She held it out to him, then reconsidered and held it to her chest instead, which told him it was personal. "Her husband's business has expanded. She is very well. She is asking me, she wrote to ask if I would like to come to Memphis for Christmas. She wants the family together." He sat down. "Do you want to go?" he asked. She looked at the letter in her hands. "Part of me does," she said. "I miss her. I miss family." "Then you should go," he said, and he meant it. She looked at him. "Clyde, you should go see your sister," he said. "You have been here since April. You have not had a day's real rest, and you have not seen your family in 2.5 years, she said quietly. "Go to Memphis," he said. He paused, then said the rest of it, which was the part that mattered, "and come back." She held his gaze for a long moment. The afternoon was cooling toward evening, the first real hint of fall in the air for the first time since spring. "I will come back," she said simply. He reached into his jacket pocket and took out the deed paperwork he had brought home from the county office. Not the deed itself, that was filed, but the receipt copy, stamped and dated. He held it out to her. She looked at it without taking it. "Read it." Her eyes went still. "You changed it," she said. "Yes." She took the paper, held it carefully, looked up at him. "Clyde," she said, and her voice was different now, thinner somehow, in the way that voices get when real emotion has removed the structure from them. "It was time," he said. "I knew it was time. I had known for a while." He leaned forward, forearms on his knees, looking at her directly. "I am not replacing her. That is not what this is. But I am here. I am present. I am the man who is alive on this ranch on this day, and I want to live in the present." He stopped. "Then I want to live in the present with you." She set the deed receipt carefully on the porch railing and stood up and turned to face him fully. "Then ask me," she said softly. "Do not make me wait for you to ask me." He stood. They were very close, and the evening was quiet around them, and the distant cattle were settling for the night with their low, comfortable sounds, and the first star was out above the eastern hill. "Sadie Baker," he said, "will you marry me and stay on this ranch and be here with me for all the seasons of it, the hard ones and the good ones?" She put her hand against his jaw, and he felt the warmth of it all the way through. "Yes," she said. "I told you I would stay." He kissed her then, not briefly the way he had in August, but fully, and she held on to him with the same thoroughness she brought to everything she did, and the evening settled around them like a blessing. Tom Eccles, who happened to be coming around the side of the barn with a bucket and stopped when he saw them, turned around and went back the way he had come. He told Pete and Joseph afterward with great satisfaction that the boss had finally gotten around to it, and Pete said it was about time again, and Joseph permitted himself a quiet smile that lasted most of the evening. Sadie went to Memphis in November for 6 weeks, and Clyde missed her with an ache that would have embarrassed him to describe to anyone, but that he acknowledged to himself with complete honesty. He wrote her 3 letters, which was 3 times more letters than he had written to anyone since Eleanor died, and she wrote back letters that were funny and detailed and warm, telling him about Margaret's 3 children and her husband's opinions about commerce and the cold weather that Memphis got that Texas simply didn't. And once, in the 3rd letter, saying that she dreamed sometimes of the ranch and of the sound the creek made in the night, and that she thought that was her heart telling her something true. He read that part 3 times. Then he folded the letter and put it in the inner pocket of his jacket, which was where important things went. She came back on the 1st of December on the stage, and he was at the Dusty Creek station with the buggy. Not the buckboard, but the actual buggy, which he had cleaned and oiled for the first time since Aliner's era. And when she came off the stage with her trunk and her bag and her eyes lit up at the sight of him standing there with his hat in his hand, he crossed the distance between them in 3 steps and held her for a long moment in the middle of the stage yard with old Harlan Riggs and 2 strangers, and Mrs. Pratt from the land office looking on with varying degrees of propriety. "You wore your good hat," she said against his shoulder. "I did not wear my good hat," he said. "Your second good hat," she said. "This is my best hat," he said. She pulled back and looked at it. Then she looked at him. "It has a hole in the brim," she said with tremendous warmth. "It is still my best hat," he said. She laughed and he laughed and Harlan Riggs grinned and helped load the trunk, and they drove home to the ranch in the cold December afternoon with the grass brown and the sky pale blue and the creek running high with winter water. And when the ranch came into sight around the bend in the road, Sadie went quiet for a moment and just looked at it. The house, the barn, the bunkhouse, the smoke from the kitchen chimney rising straight up in the still air. "Home," she said. "Home," he agreed. They were married the following February, in the parlor of the ranch house, by the circuit minister who came through Dusty Creek every 6 weeks. Tom Eccles and Pete Garza and Joseph were present, along with Clyde's cousin Harlan, who had driven up from San Antonio with his wife Clara specifically for the occasion, and who looked at the proceedings with the tremendous satisfaction of a man whose scheme had come out better than he had planned. Sadie's sister Margaret could not make the journey from Memphis in winter, but sent a long, warm letter and a gift of embroidered pillowcases that Sadie put on the bed that night with great care. The minister, a bald and jovial man named Reverend Cade, had married them with a brevity that suited both the occasion and the weather. And afterward, Clara produced a cake she had brought from San Antonio, which was only slightly the worse for 2 days of travel. And Tom produced a bottle of whiskey from somewhere. And Joseph toasted them in Comanche, which Tom and Pete did not understand, but which Clyde had learned enough of to know was gracious and true. Cousin Harlan pulled Clyde aside at some point in the evening and said, with the self-satisfaction of a man who has done a great thing, "Well." Clyde looked across the room to where Sadie was talking to Clara with her whole face lit up by the conversation and the lamp and the particular glow of a woman who has arrived somewhere she belongs. "Thank you, Harlan," Clyde said. Harlan nodded with great dignity. "You're welcome," he said. "I expect it was time." That phrase was going around, apparently. The spring of 1883 was the best the Carver Ranch had seen in years. The winter rains had been good. The grass was tall and green by March, and Clyde sold 40 head to a buyer at a price that made Tom Eccles whistle. Sadie had reorganized the books thoroughly over the winter, implementing a quarterly summary system that gave Clyde a clear picture of the ranch's financial situation in a way that 3 pages of scattered entries had never managed. She had also written a carefully argued letter to the county commissioner about the road condition on the east approach to the ranch, citing the increased commercial traffic and the cost to local ranchers of broken wagon wheels, and the road had been graded in March, which Clyde suspected had as much to do with the precision of her argument as with any civic goodwill. She had also written to the Abilene wholesale contact about setting up a cooperative buying arrangement with 3 neighboring ranches, an idea she had explained to Clyde over supper one evening in January with a piece of paper covered in figures. And he had said yes before she was finished explaining, because he had learned by then that when Sadie Baker arrived at supper with a piece of paper covered in figures, the correct answer was yes. The cooperative was formalized in April, and immediately reduced the per-pound cost of feed by a measurable percentage. Tom told Pete and Joseph, with the air of a man imparting wisdom, that the boss had married a woman who was smarter than him about money, and Pete said diplomatically that she was maybe smarter than most people about money, and Tom said that was what he had said. In June, Sadie told Clyde she was carrying their child. She told him in the kitchen in the morning with the directness that was wholly her own. He set down his coffee cup and looked at her for a full 5 seconds and then crossed the kitchen and held her, and she put her arms around him, and they stood there in the morning light without saying anything, which was all that needed to happen right then. "You are happy about it?" she asked, which was Sadie asking a question she already knew the answer to but needed to hear said plainly. "Sadie," he said, and pulled back enough to look at her face. "I am," he paused, and his voice was not entirely under control, which was unusual enough that she watched him with those clear eyes. "I am more happy than I know how to say directly." "That is enough," she said softly. Tom Eccles, upon being informed that same day, because Sadie had correctly calculated that telling Tom meant telling everyone efficiently, wept briefly, and then recovered and declared that they ought to add a room to the house. Pete said he would help build it. Joseph went to the barn and came back within the hour with a small carved wooden horse that he placed on the kitchen table without comment, which was his version of a greeting card, and was received accordingly. The room was built in August and September, a proper addition to the east side of the house with 2 windows and a good floor and shelves for a baby's things. Clyde built the crib himself, laboring over it in the evenings with a care he brought to nothing else all season, and Sadie watched him work at it with an expression she did not try to contain. "You are a good man," she said one evening, sitting in the doorway of the new room watching him sand the crib rail. "I have things to be good for now," he said. She came and sat on the floor beside his workbench, which was not the most comfortable arrangement for a woman in her 7th month, and leaned against the wall. "Do you think about a leaner when you work on this?" she asked. He kept sanding, steady and even. "Sometimes," he said. "Not with pain the way I used to. More like," he considered, "like she is part of the context. She was part of how this place came to be. She will always be part of the story of this land." "I am glad," Sadie said. He looked up from the crib. "Glad that you do not try to undo her," she said. "It tells me that you are not the kind of man who forgets the people he has loved, and that," she smiled, "that matters to me." He set the sandpaper down and sat on the floor beside her, his back against the wall, her shoulder against his. "You are not afraid of her," he said. "You never have been." "No," she said. "She gave you the shape you are. She helped make this place what it is. I arrived into something she built." She paused. "I am grateful to her." He put his arm around her and she leaned against him, and they sat in the new room in the lamplight with the night sounds of the ranch coming through the open window, and the crib stood before them in its unfinished state, and the land stretched away on all sides in the dark, full and alive. Their son was born on the 14th of November, 1883. A cold, clear night with stars so close they seemed to be listening. Sadie labored through the afternoon and evening with a combination of ferocity and composure that was entirely characteristic of her, attended by the doctor from Dusty Creek and the doctor's wife, who served as midwife. And Clyde sat on the porch through most of it, because he had been politely and firmly removed from the bedroom by the doctor's wife, who said that ranchers in the delivery room were more trouble than they were worth. He heard his son cry from the porch. The sound came through the window clear and indignant, as if the child had strong opinions about having arrived, and Clyde sat forward in his chair with his hands clasped, and his eyes closed, and felt something open in him like a country that had been locked. The doctor's wife came to the door. "Come in, Mr. Carver. Mother and son are both very well." He went in. Sadie was in the bed looking exhausted and triumphant and entirely herself, and in her arms was a small, red, furious person who had already stopped crying and was now regarding the world with an expression of serious evaluation. Clyde sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his wife and his son, and Sadie watched him take it all in. "Hello," she said softly. "Hello," he managed. "Would you like to hold him?" He took his son with the careful terror of a man who has handled thousands of animals and none of them as important as this, and the boy settled in his arms with a sigh that seemed disproportionately knowing for someone less than an hour old. "What will we name him?" Sadie asked. Clyde looked down at the child. He had dark hair, which would probably change, and his face had the particular squashed wisdom of new babies. "James," Clyde said, and then looked up at Sadie. She was very still for a moment, then her eyes went bright. "For my husband," she said. "He was a good man," Clyde said. "You told me so." "And I thought," he looked back at the baby, "I thought a boy could carry that forward." Sadie reached out and touched his arm once lightly, and looked at him with an expression that was so full it barely fit her face. "James Carver," she said softly. "It suits him." Tom Eccles and Pete Garza received the news with the enthusiasm of men who had been waiting for it since June. Tom brought a bottle of good whiskey, and Pete brought a hat too large for any child under the age of 10, which he presented with great seriousness, explaining that the boy would grow into it. Joseph brought a second carved object, a horse in mid-gallop, much finer than the first one, and placed it beside the first on the kitchen shelf. Clyde's cousin Harlan wrote from San Antonio with congratulations so profuse they required 2 pages, and added in a postscript that he hoped they would come to San Antonio for Easter, and that Clara was already planning where to put them, and that James would be spoiled enormously if Harlan had any say in it. Sadie wrote back a letter accepting the invitation, and adding that she intended to be fully recovered and ready to travel by Easter, and that she had very high standards for being spoiled and hoped Clara was equal to them, which made Harlan laugh so hard that Clara came to see what had happened. The winter of 1883 and 1884 was a good winter, in the way that winters are good when a house is full and warm, and the cold outside makes the inside feel more itself. Sadie nursed James and kept the accounts and read by the fire in the evenings, while Clyde sat across from her and read his cattle management books, and the baby slept and woke and ate and grew with the indifferent efficiency of life taking its rightful course. They had their particular arguments, which were real arguments because they were both strong-minded people, about fencing plans and cattle sales and the best approach to the South Pasture water problem. And they argued with the honest vigor of 2 people who respected each other's intelligence too much to be polite when they disagreed. And they resolved the arguments, and they were always better on the other side of them than before. He had not known it could be like this. He had been happy with a leaner, genuinely happy, but he had been younger then and happiness had felt simpler, less aware of itself. This happiness was different. It was built from specific things he could name, from Sadie's voice in the kitchen, and the way she held her pen when she was thinking, and the sound of her laughing at something James did, and the specific way she argued about cattle prices, and the look on her face when he came in from a long day in the field, and she turned from the stove and was simply glad he was there. In the spring of 1884, he sat on the porch with James on his knee, watching the creek run full with spring water, and Sadie came out with 2 cups of coffee and sat in her chair, Alina's chair, which had long since become Sadie's chair in any practical sense, and gave him his cup and looked out at the same creek. "I need to tell you something," she said. "Tell me." "Another baby," she said, and looked at him with that straight, clear gaze, waiting. He looked at her for a long moment. James grabbed his finger with both hands and held on with the grip of a boy who had been building it for 4 months. "Sadie," he said, and smiled, not the difficult smile, not the one he had had to work at, but the easy one, the one that had been coming back steadily for a year and a half. "Good," she laughed. "Just good. Very good," he said. "Considerably good." She settled back in her chair and they watched the spring light on the water, and James fell asleep between his father's hands, and the ranch spread away from the porch in all its difficult, beautiful, practical entirety, and the deed in the county office in Dusty Creek read Clyde Carver. Later that year, on an evening in August, they were eating supper and James was in his high chair with a biscuit he was applying to his face with great enthusiasm, and Sadie was talking about the price of sugar, and Clyde was listening and watching her, and thinking about nothing in particular, except that this was the evening and the house, and the family, and the feeling he had been working toward since he got up before sunrise on a cold January morning 4 years ago, and decided that the only option was to go on. "What are you thinking?" she asked, noticing him watching her. "That you said you would stay," he said. She looked at him across the table, past the lamp and the biscuit and the child and all the daily apparatus of a life. "I did say that," she agreed. "On your first day here, I said I needed to tell you something about the deed, and you said, I remember your exact words, you said, I am here to work." "I was," she said, "and now," she looked at him with those dark, clear eyes, "now I am here because it is where I am," she said simply. "This land, this house, this man," she smiled. "These cattle, God help me." He laughed, and James startled at the sound and looked at his father with round, surprised eyes, and then laughed too, for no reason except that his father was laughing, and laughter was contagious, and life was new and full of inexplicable joy. "These cattle," Clyde said, laughing still. "I have opinions about the South herd now," she said primly. "Tom knows it." "Tom is afraid of your opinions about the South herd," Clyde said. "Tom is wise," she said. Their second child came in the winter, a girl this time, who arrived just as decisively as her brother, and was named Clara after Harlan's wife, which Clara received with a letter of such pleased gratitude that it ran to 4 pages. James regarded his sister with the measured suspicion of a 14-month-old, and then within a week began to bring her things: a carved wooden horse, a biscuit, a rock from the yard, which was his own version of the gift-giving impulse, and was received by Clara with the equanimity of someone very new to the world. The years settled into their shape. The ranch grew, not explosively but steadily, the way things grow when they are well managed and honestly worked. Clyde added 50 acres to the north on a fair deal in 1885, and Sadie's cooperative buying arrangement had by then expanded to 7 ranches, and had reduced costs enough that 2 of the participating ranchers had written her letters of thanks that she kept in the desk drawer without showing anyone. Pete Garza married a woman named Rosario from the neighboring area in the fall of 1885, and they built a small house on the east edge of the Carver land. And Rosario and Sadie became the kind of friends who argued about recipes and borrowed things without asking, and told each other the truth without managing it, which was the best kind. Tom Eccles remained Tom Eccles, the constant and reliable shape of the ranch's human landscape, older and more weather-beaten and increasingly content. He told anyone who asked that the Carver Ranch was the best place he had ever worked, and when anyone asked why, he said it was because both the boss and the boss's wife knew what they were doing and didn't interfere with each other doing it, which was the highest praise he had in his vocabulary, and he knew it. Joseph remained as well, though his situation changed slightly in the late summer of 1885, when a man came to the ranch looking for him, not with trouble, as Clyde and Tom had both instinctively stepped forward to make clear would not be welcome, but with news from Joseph's family north of the territory. Joseph spoke with the man for an hour, and then came to Clyde in the evening and said he needed to go north for some time, perhaps a month, perhaps longer, and Clyde said of course, and gave him a horse and a month's wages, and said the bunkhouse room would be there when he came back. Joseph came back in 10 weeks with a wife named Sarah, a quiet and observant woman who had grown up speaking both Comanche and some English, and who looked at the ranch and the people on it with the same patient evaluation that Joseph brought to everything. She helped with the garden and the horses and became, over time, the person you went to if you had a question about plants medicinal or culinary. And she and Sadie developed a wordless working relationship built on mutual competence and respect that did not require much verbal apparatus to function. In the spring of 1886, Clyde came home from a cattle drive to find that Sadie had re-roofed the east barn in his absence. She had organized Tom and Pete and Joseph and 2 men hired from town, and the work was done in 4 days, and the barn stood with its new cedar shingles gleaming in the afternoon sun. He stood at the yard fence looking at it for a full minute. She came to stand beside him, James on her hip and Clara at her skirts. "The old shingles were going to fail before winter," she said. "I know," he said. "Tom said you had been meaning to do it for 2 years." "I had." "I thought it was a good moment," she said, with a composure that had a thread of amusement in it if you knew where to look. He looked at her. She was watching the barn with a proprietary satisfaction that was entirely warranted. Clara was holding her skirt with both hands, and James was already heading toward the barn door at the purposeful toddle of a 2.5-year-old who wanted to see the inside of everything. "I married a capable woman," Clyde said. "You did," she agreed without false modesty. He put his arm around her shoulders. "I am grateful for it every single day." She leaned into him. "Good," she said. "So you should be." The mockingbird in the cedar tree by the water trough sang 3 different songs in rapid succession, and then started a 4th. The barn stood new and solid in the afternoon sun. The creek ran steady in the near distance. James disappeared into the barn door and immediately called back for his father, which was either something interesting or something dangerous, and the odds were roughly even. Clyde went to find his son, and Sadie followed with Clara, and the ranch lay around them in the warmth and the wide silence of the Texas afternoon. 400-and-odd acres of grass and sky and creek water and gathered years. The dead remembered and honored, and the living fully present. The whole complicated breathing entity of a life that had been kept running through grief and stubbornness, and then opened when the time came, to something worth keeping it for. The deed read Clyde Carver, and the house had curtains and a tablecloth and 2 children and a kitchen garden that Sadie had planted with intention. And in the evening when they sat on the porch, the 2 chairs were side by side, and the coffee was strong and the coyotes sang in the North Hills, and neither of them had to reach very far for the other in the dark. It was not a complicated happiness. It was just the real kind, which is the hardest to come by and the most worth having, and Clyde Carver and Sadie Baker knew it for what it was, and did not take a single ordinary day of it for granted.